All right, so I want to talk about refactoring and kind of a lesson that I had on a project, working on some forms, and how you can go about refactoring the correct way and then refactoring the not correct way. And sometimes it happens. I mean, sometimes it's a case by case basis, but here's kind of the gist of it. So I was working on these forms for selling a vehicle, and it started off like they were simple forms. It was just you could accept an offer, counter, decline. You could do like in person, phone, um, and the feature was worked on by various different people, and for about a year and a half. Just we had this form. We slowly added features, and actually me and this other developer really worked on the front end forms piece when we first started, and so I was asked to add another field, another radio button. I was like, I think it was you can email, you could receive an email, and then you could accept, counter, decline. And how the code worked was on submit. It would all boil down to one method. So we'd have all these checks. If it's an in-person interaction, do this validation and run this checks, and then you're going to send an email or all these different potential actions. So I went in there and I was like, okay, so I could just add to this giant conditional. I mean, it was huge and it was nested. And when I looked at it, I was like, ooh, and it really wasn't even all that well unit tested. So I started off. I threw the conditional in there. If it's if it was an email, and if it's an inbound email, you can accept, counter, decline. So I went through that flow. And then I actually ended up talking to my tech lead, and we kind of worked through and figured out like potential patterns for this type of scenario. And it turns out we could use like the state pattern, which I have never actually really worked with the state pattern. So he kind of guided me to that, and I did a lot of research on this website, Refactor Guru, and so it's like, okay, here's a state pattern. It really looks like it would fit perfect in there, and a state pattern is when you have behavior that changes at runtime, or it's changed based on like outside, like a user does something, or you get some piece of data, and now the behavior is different. It seems like a good fit, and so we'd have like a sale interaction, and then as like a abstract class, and then you could have an email interaction that's going to inherit from that sale interaction, and then we'd have the email interaction, phone interaction, make these classes, and it seemed like it would work perfect. And the thing is, this was code that was heavily used, so it was in production, and we had a lot of people using it, and it was one of these business critical pieces. So we didn't really want to break it, and this is kind of where I went off on a tangent, and I learned a lot, and it worked out well, but it really got me like researching on how best to actually refactor. So I was on this Refactor Guru website, saw the state patterns, like, okay, I could totally do this. Then I just started deleting code and ripping stuff out and putting in the bare bones pieces to make my stuff work. So it took it only took like 4 or 5 hours, and things were kind of working good. And I was looking wow. Granted, I touched many different files and just started deleting so much of this production code that was really, it was kind of nasty code over the years. So it took like 4 or 5 hours, and things were kind of working good. And then went to the next day, and then I wasn't really unit testing. I just kept deleting code and then making it fit this pattern. And it ended up actually taking like 5 or 6 days to get it to where it was like I was happy with it. Like it went down where I was working on it, and then like it got big. And I don't know if you're a developer, you've worked on something where you're writing some code, and then all of a sudden you check your Git, and you're like, all right, what all's changed here? Like, oh my god, I touched everything, and so I kept going down this rabbit hole. And it was good. I was making progress, but it was slow progress. And honestly, like the feature, I was just adding one little field and some small functionality changes that really, it shouldn't take that long. But this bad code, which I actually helped write, is slowing me down. I felt like, since I kind of helped write this code and that saw it grow, I was like, I want to make this right and figure out how to make this, like when you look at the Git and you're like, oh, Robert touched it. I want people to be like, wow, this is really well thought out code. So it's ripping stuff out, and then the daily stand-ups. Like I go to the daily stand-ups, we're like, yep, I'm still working on this refactor. The next one is like, oh, yep, still working on it. And then it ended up being like the end of the sprint, and I 100% missed the sprint. and it got to be this whole big deal. And like before I went into this, I like created a branch with the nasty fix, and then I created another branch. I was like where I started refactoring, and the tech lead, like we had the team conversation. They're like, let's just use the branch with the nasty fix, and let's tackle this later. And I was so deep. I was like a week and a half into this thing. So I was like, no, we can't do that. We can't do that. And I was working like 6 days a week. And it took me so I missed a sprint deadline, whatever, sprint goal. And then it rolled in the next sprint, and I got it to where it's working really well. But I completely neglected a bunch of unit tests. Didn't touch it. Like I basically, so I was working, got Refactor Guru, this. It's like, okay, the state pattern is awesome. Cleaned up the code, understood it. It was awesome. Then I started running my unit tests, and it was like 70 or 80 just red X's everywhere, and all the tests were failing. I had no idea which tests were there and which ones, how this stuff should go. So then I had to I went file by file, method by method, started writing unit tests and pulling things over. And that process took a long time, because we had these quality gates. We had to have like 75% code coverage and all these things. So I got the pull requests in draft mode, just so people could start looking at it. And then all of a sudden I had a bunch of unit tests. And again, I missed the sprint. In the next sprint, it took a long time to get these unit tests written. And actually, writing the unit test was a great experience. And then it caught bugs. And I highly suggest, and this is one of the first learnings is, and I saw this Martin Fowler. He had a talk on this on refactoring, and I should have watched. I actually did see the talk on how you correctly refactor. And the idea is your tests should always pass; they're always green, and you never leave the code in a broken state. And then ideally, you're not refactoring on new functionality. So I should have added that new radio button or whatever, and then done a small refactor that doesn't change the behavior at all. It's just for cleaning the code. And then all the tests should pass. And they're small, incremental. Make your change, tests fail, fix the tests, and that process. So it was so much unit testing, and then, but it's hard. It's also hard because when you're doing something newer, especially working with a design pattern or something that you've never worked with before, you don't know how it's going to implement until it's you're in the weeds doing it. So it's so the Martin Fowler thing, I watched his videos, and he's saying so you see some code that's not quite right. You got ideally you have your test bed that gives you confidence, right? You run your tests, they're green, good to go. You can ship it to prod, and then you're like, okay, I can pull this conditional logic out into a class, and we can have this thing, and then you make your change, and then you get your unit tests to pass, and you ship that in this slow, small increments. And by the time this thing was done, it was it wasn't that many files changed. It was 23 files changed, but it was basically a rewrite of these forms. It had, and it wasn't the most complex forms, but it definitely had accept counter declines, and you could email, and you could log all these interactions for sales, and just the idea that it was a revenue behind this form. So we couldn't mess it up. So I remember I was so stressed out because I was it's one of those ones where I'm sure if you've been developing, you know what it's like. You start something, you get into it, and there's a moment where you're like, did I bite off did I bite off too much here? And it's one of those ones where you got to get it done. So even if you bit off too much, you're gonna get it done. And I had that moment, and then it was quite a bit more. It was a week more after that where the business people, the stand-ups were getting kind of weird because I was same thing. It's yep, still working on it. And I was I swear I'm making progress. And I was pushing my changes up to, I had this draft PR for a whole week. And I kept pushing changes. I was yep, it's making progress. But it was a big chunk of code. And I ended up so it got deployed, and we checked App Insights to make sure nothing weird was happening, and it worked well. And there was, so far there's no issues with it, but it was probably the first time where I really was saw a big piece of code, and I was I want to clean this up to something I'm really proud of. And I got some good feedback from this guy, the tech lead, who was really smart. He's been in the industry for a long, long time, and he really knows the patterns. And he brought up the state pattern, and it ended up fitting really well. So I learned a lot about the different patterns and the refactoring. But you developers out there, especially junior developers, when you're cleaning code up, the idea is you have a good, write your unit tests, make them green, and then small change that doesn't affect the behavior, just cleans up the code, and then ship it. And then the Boy Scout rule, right? Like Bob Martin always talks about in clean code. Like every time you touch it, if you always make it a little bit cleaner, then then the trend is going to be in the correct direction. And then 2-3 years down, you're not hating working in this code base. Because I mean, when it started, I'm telling you, this one method got so hairy nasty. It was like doing validation checking. It was sending emails. It was logging contacts for our like business intelligence kind of thing. Like it was doing everything. So like just take the time when you see that, it's kind of tough when you're in the weeds because the business wants to ship features, and that's why you gotta always ship features because at the end of the day that's what we do. But then you also gotta make sure that we're not building up so much trash and tech debt that it's just terrible to work in, and that's one where it's like you can't just be like, hey business, we're not doing anything. We're gonna just like rewrite the application. That doesn't work, and that's why it's got to be like the Boy Scout rule and having those unit tests and slowly every time you touch it, and then the next person that touches it. Ideally, if you have like a team that's got that like as its culture where as we touch code, we leave it cleaner. That's the best way to do it, and one of those things is like it takes a lot of practice to do well, and I'm sure I'm gonna mess up at it again in the future, where you bite off too much, but those are learning experiences, and as we like strive to be the best developers we can be, that's something to just always be thinking about. So I'm gonna leave a link in the description of the Martin Fowler talk on refactoring that I saw that was really good and talked about like how to correctly refactor and how to not correctly refactor. And it kind of goes along the same lines of this story of don't just rewrite the whole thing and make sure your tests are always passing and your application works at all times. Don't just start ripping stuff out. So that is my story on refactoring, and I highly recommend it. And especially like when you're newer, you just like getting stuff done, and it doesn't really matter as much about how clean and like beautiful and well structured the code is, but it's so like working in a code base where things are well structured and logically placed, and there's good patterns behind things. Like it's amazing. There's no places for bugs to hide, and like it is a joy to work in. On the other side, if you've been in a code base, it's real nasty. It's terrible. You're in a debugger constantly being like, how the heck did this system get in this spot? So yeah, refactoring, highly suggested.